In this example, I need to simplify negative 16 to the 3/2 power. This one gets a little tricky because you have to figure out, does the 3/2 apply to the 16 or the negative 16? Well, if I'd have wanted to raise negative 16 to the 3/2 power, I would have had to have written the negative 16 in parentheses. That is not the case here. When I have a negative in front of 16 to the 3/2 power, this really means I have negative 1 times 16 to the 3/2 power. Next, we have to figure out what 16 raised to the 3/2 power means. So I have a number raised to a rational exponent or a fractional exponent. So I've written what rational exponents mean up here. If I have a raised to the m over n, there's two different ways of writing it. I can write it as the nth root of a to the m, or I can write it as the nth root of a all raised to the mth power. Now, if I have a variable, I'm going to use this method here because it's much more compact and efficient. But if my base is a number, I'm going to write it this way because I deal with much smaller numbers that are easier to figure out. In this case, the base is a number, so I'm going to use this method here. And notice the denominator of my fractional exponent becomes the index of the radical. The numerator of my fractional exponent becomes the power to which I raise that radical. So I'm going to use that method for my example here. So I'm going to have negative 1 times, and now I need to have my radical. So I'm going to have a radical sign. I'm going to put 16 under the radical. And what is the index of my radical? There's the denominator of this fraction, so it's a 2. And the numerator, 3, is the power to which I raise that radical. But remember, do we ever write a square root like this? No, so I'm going to have negative 1 times the square root of 16 all cubed. Because remember, if there's no index showing, we know it's a 2. So now I have to figure out the square root of 16. 16 is a perfect square, and its square root is 4. So I have negative 1 times 4 cubed, which is negative 1 times 4 cubed, remember, is 4 times 4 times 4. So 4 fours are 16, 16 times 4 is 64, negative 1 times 64 is negative 64. So my answer is negative 64. I just wanted to point out what would have happened if I'd have written 16 to the 3/2 power this way. So if I have 16 to the 3/2 power, and I use this method here, I'm going to have 16 underneath my radical sign. The denominator is the index. 3 is the power to which I raise the 16 before I take the square root. So this would require me to take the square root of 16 cubed. So I would have to take 16, multiply it by itself 3 times, and then I'd have to take the square root of that very large number. Hopefully you can see writing it this way makes the arithmetic a whole lot easier.